The roar of a motorcycle engine has always had a way of setting hearts racing, particularly those of women with a penchant for danger. Madalena was no exception to this rule. For her, the allure of chrome and leather was irresistible, a siren song that called to her very soul. Picture, if you will, a statuesque blonde astride a sleek, black iron horse, her golden hair whipping in the wind as she clings to a rugged biker. But this tale isn't just about riding motorcycles or the seductive purr of a well-tuned engine, it's about riding other things. James never thought he'd be the guy saying, "I had to get married, but life has a way of throwing curveballs." It wasn't just him, though. His girlfriend Madalena was in on it too. The whole thing might sound forced, but deep down, they both wanted it. Madalena dropped the bomb one Friday evening. "I've got news," she said, her blue eyes twinkling. James couldn't help but admire her petite frame and blonde hair as he asked, "Good or bad?" With a nervous grin, Madalena replied, "Could go either way, depends on you." The rest, as they say, is history. Within moments, they were wrapped in each other's arms, professing their love and planning their shotgun wedding. Talk about a whirlwind romance. "Whenever works for your family," Madalena offered, ever the accommodating bride-to-be. James shrugged. "I've got no family left since Aunt Beth died. And let's face it, I'm not exactly Mr. Popular in Leicester." It was a sad truth, but there it was. Madalena's story wasn't much happier. She'd lost her parents in a motorcycle crash as a kid. After bouncing around foster care, she landed with Auntie Beth, her mom's old friend from Leeds. But fate had other plans, and Beth passed away just before James could meet her. "What about Beth's son?" James asked, treading carefully. "Weren't you close with Tom? Don't you want him there?" Madalena's face darkened. "Tom's in jail, James. I've told you before, I don't want to talk about him." Oops. James mentally kicked himself. He knew Tom was doing time, but the details were fuzzy. "Time for a subject change. My parents are retired, so any date should work," he said quickly. Madalena's anger evaporated as she stroked her still flat tummy. "The sooner the better, James," she smiled. "Let's call them now." And just like that, the wheels were in motion. 4 weeks later, they tied the knot at the Bedford registry office. It was a small affair, just James's relatives and a few mutual friends. They honeymooned in the West Indies, soaking up the sun and basking in newlywed bliss. It wasn't until they got back that Madalena's belly started to show signs of their little bundle of joy. They named her Beth, after the woman Madalena saw as a mother. James thought it was perfect, and Madalena loved him all the more for it. Married life was pretty sweet. Sure, they had their squabbles, but overall, James and Madalena settled into a good rhythm with their baby girl. As Beth grew, she took after her mom's side of the family, blonde hair with a hint of red in the right light. But she had James's even-keeled temperament, rarely crying or getting upset. It was the best of both worlds, though James never dared say that out loud to Madalena. 4 years flew by, and suddenly, things started to unravel in the Dawson household. Beth was her usual happy self, and James was content, but Madalena? Something was off. She'd quit her job when Beth was born, and with James bringing home the bacon, she never went back. They'd moved to a nice little village north of Bedford, and a few times a week, Madalena would take Beth into town for shopping, doctor's appointments, or catch-ups with old work friends. But lately, she'd come home from these trips looking pensive, like something was eating at her. James remembered how Madalena used to get moody in the early days of their relationship, but this felt different. He tried asking what was wrong, but all he got was a shake of the head. The thought of an affair crossed his mind, but Madalena always had Beth with her. Still, something was definitely up. Finally, James couldn't take it anymore. "What's the matter, Madalena?" he demanded. She looked at him with sad eyes. "I think I owe you an explanation, James. You're going to find out soon enough anyway, so I might as well get it over with." James felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Was she sick? Was there something wrong with Beth? "Put Beth to bed, dear," Madalena suggested with a sigh. "Then come downstairs and we'll talk." James's mind raced as he tucked Beth in, grateful she was too sleepy for a bedtime story. He needed to know what was going on. Back downstairs, Madalena pointed to a chair across from her at the table. Not a good sign. James, dear, she began, taking a deep breath. You've asked about Tom a few times, and I've never told you anything, have I? James nodded, his throat suddenly dry. You always blow me off. Well, it's time to tell you about Tom, Madalena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. As Madalena unfolded the story of her past with Tom, James felt like he was stepping into an episode of Sons of Anarchy. Hell's Angels? Madalena as a wild biker chick? It was hard to reconcile with the woman he thought he knew. James listened, slack-jawed, as Madalena spilled the beans about her past. Tom wasn't just some guy, he was her pseudo-brother-turned-boyfriend, and things had gotten pretty intense between them. What did his mom think about all this? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She was all for it, Madalena replied, avoiding his gaze. Tom was a wild child, just like his dad before he bit the dust on his bike. I never told you, but my parents and Tom's folks were all part of the same biker gang, Hell's Angels and everything. James nearly choked. Hell's Angels? Seriously? Yep, all 4 of them, Madalena confirmed. But your parents died in a bike accident too, didn't they? Madalena nodded sadly. They were riding with a big group to Brighton when they took a corner too fast and wiped out. And Tom's dad? James asked cautiously. It happened just 4 months later. He was hit by a truck on his way to work. Aunt Beth lost her husband and 2 best friends in such a short time that she swore off bikes for good. James tried to wrap his head around it all. So Beth took you in and raised you as her own? Yeah, and she was cool with Tom and me being together, Madalena continued, lost in memories. Tom was a total adrenaline junkie, always racing bikes without a care in the world. Beth figured I might be a good influence on him. And were you? James asked, dreading the answer. Madalena sighed. Not exactly. If anything, it was the other way around. I ended up being just as wild as Tom. We were part of a bike gang, doing all kinds of stuff we shouldn't have been. You mean like speeding? James asked, hoping it wasn't worse. Yeah, that and a lot more. We had quite the reputation with the local cops. James felt his stomach churn. Is that how Tom ended up in jail? Madalena didn't answer right away, and James could see her steeling herself for what came next. Sort of, she finally muttered. James waited, his heart pounding. Madalena took a deep breath. We were out with the bike club one night, coming back from Manchester. We stopped to meet up with another group we knew. Tom was riding his new Honda with me on the back, and I was begging him to let me try it. As Madalena recounted the fateful night, James felt like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Her flirting with another biker, the jealousy, the reckless behavior, it was all so far removed from the Madalena he thought he knew. Jesus, Madalena, James gasped. I can't believe what I'm hearing. This doesn't sound anything like the woman I married. Madalena looked at him remorsefully. It was all a few years ago, James. I'm older and wiser now, I swear. James gestured for her to continue, his mind reeling. The story only got wilder from there. Madalena described the growing tension between the 2 biker groups, her reckless behavior, and the dangerous game she was playing. So this Mike guy actually suggested you ride topless? James asked incredulously. Madalena's confession hit him like a punch to the gut. I'd done it before, James. Several times. Only on the back with Tom, of course. James shook his head, struggling to process it all. I'm having a hard time accepting this, Madalena. It's not like the girl I met and married at all. I've told you, James, I'm different now, Madalena insisted. But back then, it was, well, fun? Fun? James echoed. Jesus, Madalena. You were a real piece of work back then, weren't you? Madalena nodded, surprisingly calm. I guess I was. But you have to understand, in that world, guys ruled. When a girl got a chance to have some power over them, it was a real rush. That's probably why there were so many fights over women. As Madalena continued her story, James felt like he was watching a car crash in slow motion. The reckless bike ride, the chase, the loss of control, it was all too much. "What happened, Madalena?" James asked softly, dreading the answer. Through tears, Madalena described the horrific accident. The bike sliding out, the impact with Mike's car, waking up in the hospital after being in a coma. "And this Mike guy?" James demanded. "What happened to him?" Madalena's voice was barely a whisper. "Dead." But there was more to the story, and James couldn't wrap his head around it. "I don't understand. You were driving the motorcycle, and Tom was just a passenger. How did he end up in jail?" Madalena's answer shocked him to his core. "He took all the blame, James. By the time I came to my senses and realized what was going on, it was too late. Tom told the police he was the one in the front seat. He took the fall for me." James struggled to comprehend Tom's actions. "But why would he do that, Madalena? Why would he take the blame?" Madalena's answer was simple but devastating. "Because he loved me. I was his woman, and he wanted to protect me." The weight of the revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James broke the silence. "What else haven't you told me, Madalena? There's got to be more to Tom's actions than what you've said so far." Madalena nodded, looking defeated. "You're right, of course. At the time, believe it or not, Tom had a clean record. He'd been pulled over a few times, gotten some speeding tickets, but nothing major. Mike didn't look too bad after the accident, so Tom didn't think it would be a big deal to take the blame. Unlike Tom, I had a couple of priors, and he was afraid I'd get prosecuted." James felt like his world was spinning. "You had priors? Jesus, Madalena, were you some kind of criminal?" Madalena tried to downplay it. "Not exactly, James. I've already told you about the wild stuff we got up to." They were both for indecent exposure. James's eyebrows shot up. "What? Riding naked on a bike around the campground is one thing, but the cops weren't too thrilled when we did it downtown," Madalena explained with a guilty smile. "Twice?" James asked, incredulous. "More than twice," Madalena admitted in a whisper. "I got caught 3 times, but they let me off with a warning the first time." James felt like he was going to be sick. As Madalena continued explaining how Mike's condition had suddenly worsened and Tom had stuck to his story to protect her, James struggled to process it all. When she finished, James sighed heavily. "Sounds like you owe Tom big time, Madalena. When's he getting out?" Madalena's face fell. "That's the problem, James. He's got a few more years left on his sentence, but I just found out they're giving him early release for good behavior. He'll be out soon." "How soon?" James asked, dreading the answer. "Thursday," Madalena replied, shocking him. "The day after tomorrow. That's why I've been so upset these past couple weeks." James put his head in his hands. Jesus, what a mess. As he sat there, trying to wrap his head around everything, James realized the implications. Tom had sacrificed everything for Madalena, and now he was coming back to a world where his mother was dead and his girlfriend had married someone else. "I guess he's got nowhere to go when he gets out, huh?" James asked, praying he was wrong. Madalena confirmed his fears. "Not really. His mom's house was only rented, and he's lost touch with his old friends in Leeds." Suddenly, something clicked in James's mind. "Wait a minute, I'm missing something. How do you know all this if he's in prison somewhere up north?" Madalena's voice was barely audible. "He's not up north, James. He was, but he got into fights there and was transferred." "To where?" James asked, already knowing the answer. "To Bedford," Madalena muttered. "Right here, to Bedford prison." James laughed bitterly. "What a bloody coincidence." Madalena burst into tears. "I'm sorry, James, darling. I know I should have told you ages ago, but I kept putting it off, and it just got harder and harder. I felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of it." A horrible thought occurred to James. "So all those trips to Bedford, you've been visiting him?" Madalena shrugged, not finishing her sentence. As they stood there, staring at each other and wondering what to say next, Madalena dropped another bombshell. I moved here to be near him, James. I thought it would work out, but I didn't count on meeting anyone else. I didn't expect to fall in love with another man. James felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. What are we going to do now, Madalena? I don't know, James, she replied, looking lost. James knew what he had to do, even if he hated it. He didn't even know Tom, but Madalena owed him a huge debt of gratitude. And Madalena was his wife. Time to be the bigger person. Look, Madalena, he began reluctantly. I don't like the idea, but I suppose he could crash here for a few days. Just long enough to get back on his feet. Maybe we could help him out with some cash to get started. To his surprise, Madalena shook her head. I can't, James. Why not? James asked, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. I don't think it would work, James. Why not? James growled, feeling his patience wear thin. I'm trying to be understanding here. Madalena's next words hit him like a truck. He doesn't know about you, James. Tom doesn't know I'm married. I'm sorry, darling, but I never had the guts to tell him. He still thinks I'm waiting for him to get out. James felt like the world was spinning. You've got to be kidding me. You never told him? Madalena looked utterly defeated. I've ruined everything, haven't I? The rest of the evening passed like a nightmare. They danced around each other, both trying to figure out what to do next. When they finally spoke again, James tried to make Madalena see reason. You've got to tell Tom the truth next time, Madalena. The longer you put it off, the harder it's going to be. He was furious with her for being so stupid, especially since she was usually such an organized and honest person. But Madalena was his wife. He loved her to bits, and of course, there was Beth to think about. Yeah, Beth. That's when it hit him. James realized that Madalena still had strong feelings for Tom, even if she wasn't admitting it. But they had Beth together, so he tried not to worry too much about Madalena's past love. Part of him wanted to demand that Madalena tell Tom to back off, but deep down, he knew that would be a mistake. Madalena had to handle this on her own, and it was his job to support her through it. The next day, the day before Tom's release, Madalena went to visit him and tell him the truth. It wasn't going to be easy, but it had to be done. James took the day off work to be there when she got back, knowing she'd need his support. He waited at home, his insides churning, wondering what state she'd be in when she returned. Hi, Madalena, he greeted her at the door as she walked up the garden path. How did it go? How did Tom take it? Madalena's response threw him for a loop. Didn't take it, she replied, looking confused. What do you mean he didn't take it? James asked, baffled. Madalena slipped past him into the house. I didn't tell him, James. He was so excited, like it was the best day of his life. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't break his heart when he was so happy. James felt his anger rising. For God's sake, Madalena. Do you think he'll feel better tomorrow? You think he'll be less upset? Grow up, you stupid woman. Madalena's next words hit him like a slap in the face. I'm not going to tell him tomorrow either, James. I've made my decision, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to give him a few days of happiness before I destroy him. It's the least I owe him, whatever it costs me. James stood there, mouth agape, as the meaning of her words sank in. A few days of happiness? He asked anxiously. Madalena nodded, finally meeting his eyes with a determined expression. Yes, James. I've booked a hotel room in town for tomorrow night, and I intend to repay Tom for what he's done for me. James exploded. No way, Madalena. If you think I'm gonna stand by while another man sleeps with my wife, you've got another thing coming. Jesus, woman, I know you owe him, but this is insane. You can't do this. Madalena stood her ground. You can't stop me, James, she shouted back. It's my decision, my body, and I'm going to do what I have to do. I owe him so much, James. Please try to understand. Understand? You're talking about cheating on me. James was livid. It's not happening, Madalena. No way in hell. I've already made up my mind, James, Madalena insisted. Please, why can't you see where I'm coming from? James felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Then I might not be here when you get back, Madalena, he threatened. If you sleep with him even once, our marriage is over. Madalena's face fell. I was hoping you'd be more understanding, James. You know the situation I'm in. I have to do this. Please, James, try to see it from my perspective. There's nothing to understand. James exclaimed angrily. Then there's nothing left to talk about, Madalena shouted back. James, why can't you get it? I'm not taking anything away from you. You do this, and we're finished. Screw you, you miserable bastard, Madalena fired back before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind her. James was left standing there, completely bewildered. He tried to talk to her later that night, but when it became clear he wasn't backing down, she just shut him out. He wanted to strangle her, unable to believe she couldn't see what she was doing to their relationship. What about Beth? He thought desperately. God, what about poor Beth, whose life is about to be torn apart? The next day, James took their daughter Beth out, unable to watch Madalena go through with her plan. During their outing, Beth innocently revealed she knew Tom from prison visits with her mother, shocking James further. That night, Madalena called. James demanded to know if she'd gone through with it. Madalena confirmed she had, twice already. When James lashed out, Madalena cruelly retorted that Tom knew how to please a woman. She went on to describe how she had pleased Tom, doing everything with her mouth that he had asked for, and how he responded with such passion and intensity that she had never experienced before. Devastated, James hung up and broke his cell phone to avoid her calls. He stood alone, weeping as his life fell apart around him, feeling a deep hatred for the world. James stood there for what felt like hours, half hoping Madalena would show up and make things right. But that was impossible, and of course, she didn't come back. It wasn't until he thought of little Beth, sleeping peacefully upstairs, that he pulled himself together. She was all he had left, and that gave him the strength to carry on. He brewed himself a cup of tea, the British solution to all of life's problems, and sat down to think about how his life was about to change. Could he get Madalena back? God, what a question. His brain was screaming, no, but his heart was speaking a different language, one he could barely understand. The only thing he was sure of was that for Beth's sake, he had to be strong. He'd fight tooth and nail to keep her with him, no matter what Madalena tried. Hell, he even considered taking Madalena back for Beth's sake, but who was he kidding? He wanted Madalena back for his own sake, no matter what she'd done. But he knew it would never be the same. It wouldn't work. It couldn't happen. And he broke down again, thinking about what was about to happen to the sweet little girl sleeping soundly upstairs, blissfully unaware of the chaos around her. Why would you do this to the people who love you? The next morning, James woke up to tiny fingers poking his face. Wake up, Daddy, Beth's voice filtered through his foggy brain. Why didn't you go to bed last night? Good morning, sweetheart, James greeted her groggily. I just fell asleep on the couch and forgot to go to bed. Silly Daddy, Beth giggled. Mom will think you're stupid when I tell her. James felt a pang in his chest. I think Mom already thinks I'm stupid, he sighed. Dad took time off work to watch you again. Where do you want to go? Beth's face lit up. Can we go to the zoo, please, Daddy? James couldn't help but smile. But we went there yesterday, Sweet Pea. But I want to go again, Daddy, she insisted, clapping her hands together. I want to see the big elephants and the funny monkeys and… What are those big ones with the long funny necks called, Daddy? Giraffes, honey, James answered. But you saw them all yesterday. How about we go to Old Warden and look at the old airplanes? Beth's face scrunched up. Are there lions and tigers and things there? No, Beth, James explained, already regretting his suggestion of an old airplane museum he hadn't visited in years. But they have lots of other interesting things. Do they have a McDonald's there, Dad? James chuckled. Probably not, but we can find one on the way home. And just like that, their plans were set. Half an hour later, they were on their way back to the zoo. It turned out to be a nice day, and for a few hours, James was able to forget his troubles and enjoy time with his daughter. He wondered if she might become a veterinarian when she grew up, given her love for animals. Everything was fine until they walked out of McDonald's, stuffed with burgers and milkshakes. That's when the dark clouds started to descend again. How the hell had he screwed this up? How had he let his marriage fall apart and ruined little Beth's life? Maybe, just maybe, he and Madalena could get past her transgression. In a few years, all this drama with Tom might be a distant memory. Maybe. By the time they got home, Beth was ready for bed. They cuddled up on the couch, and for the second night in a row, James carried her sleeping form upstairs. So far, so good. But now came the hard part, waiting alone to see what time Madalena would return. They hadn't discussed it, so he had no idea when she'd be back. Hell, all they'd done was yell at each other since she dropped her bombshell. James promised himself that when she came back, he'd keep his cool and try to talk things out rationally. Deep down, he understood why she felt she had to do what she did, but she had to see his point of view too. He seriously doubted they could overcome what he saw as her betrayal, but for Beth's sake, he'd do his best. But only if she did too. He waited until 9 o'clock, somehow convinced that would be when she'd return. Then he waited until 10 and started to get angry again. At 20 past 10, the newly reconnected phone rang. "Hello, James Dawson speaking," he answered cautiously. "Are you in a better mood than you were last night, James?" Madalena's voice demanded. "Not much, Madalena," he replied tersely. "When are you coming home?" "Depends on you, James," she said, instantly reminding him of that fateful day when she first told him she was pregnant with Beth. "If I come back in the morning, are you going to talk sense to me instead of yelling?" "Tomorrow morning?" James repeated. "You have to come back tonight." "There's been a change of plan, James," she announced. "Now are you going to talk sense or not?" James counted to 5 to contain his anger before answering. "Have you told him yet? Does he know about us being married?" "Yes, James, he does." "So? How did he take it?" "He took it pretty well," Madalena informed him, as if discussing someone being kicked off the village soccer team. "He took it a lot better than you did." "Yeah," James replied, fighting the urge to yell. "And where exactly were you two when he took the news so well?" Silence. "And what exactly were you two doing when you broke the news to him, Madalena?" James continued, his voice rising. "Or were you already done?" Still no answer. "I'll see you when you get home, Madalena," James announced into the silent phone. "That's when we'll decide if it's still your house or not." There was a click as Madalena hung up on him. The next morning, James got Beth up, made her favorite breakfast, and drove her to her Saturday morning dance class. He arranged with another mom to pick her up and keep her for a while if he didn't make it back in time. Madalena usually picks her up, but she's been away for a couple nights, he explained vaguely, wondering how long it would be before the gossip mill started churning. "No problem," the other mom smiled. "Beth can hang out with us all day if you want some alone time with Madalena." "Thanks," James managed, trying to force a smile but not quite sure if he succeeded. 15 minutes later, he was walking back to their house, his heart racing when he saw Madalena's car already parked in its usual spot outside. This wasn't how he wanted things to go down, but hell, what choice did he have? "Where's Beth?" Madalena asked sharply as James closed the door. "Where do you think?" he replied, his tone icy. "You didn't do anything stupid, did you, James?" she accused. "Or mad. Depends on whether you think taking her to dance lessons is stupid," he cut her off. "Oh, right. Sorry, I forgot," Madalena muttered, looking embarrassed. Round 1 to James, but there was still a long way to go. "Look, James," she began again. "Tom's been really good about this whole mess. He made me realize I'm not being fair to you. If we just sit down and talk things through, we both think we can come up with something that will make all 3 of us happy." "I assume you mean all 4 of us," James clarified. "Aren't you forgetting Beth?" "Yes, of course, James," Madalena hastily replied. "Of course, I mean all 4 of us." Round 2 to James as well. He was racking up points, but the future still looked bleak. He gestured for her to continue. "The thing is, James, I do love you and always will," Madalena explained. "But now that Tom's back, things have changed." "How so?" I don't think I ever stopped loving him, James, his wife admitted. I'm sorry, but I love two men. The problem is, James reminded her bitterly, the other one can give you pleasure. James, she shrieked. I didn't mean to say that. I got angry and lost my temper. I shouldn't have said it. But it's true, isn't it? So what? Madalena sobbed. What difference does it make? I've never complained about your performance, and I never will. You never will because you'll never have the chance to compare us again. Please, James, she continued desperately. At least listen to what Tom and I have come up with. Please just hear us out. James shrugged, half agreeing to listen. Madalena's voice grew more confident as she continued. We, meaning Tom and I, decided we could work out an arrangement. I could keep living here with you and Beth, so we'd still be a little family unit. Tom would get a place nearby. So you could visit him, I suppose, James asked incredulously. Yeah, but I'd spend most nights here with you, James. But half the nights with him, James muttered, realizing things weren't going well. Half the nights wouldn't be enough, would it, Madalena? Do you really think I'm going to agree to that? James asked quietly. You get the best of both worlds. Tom gets his freedom, and I get to be a cuckold who'll probably end up supporting all of us. I guess not, she whispered. Not when you put it that way. Tell you what, Madalena, James began. You call Tom right now and tell him to get his ass back to Leeds, and I might take you back. I don't think that's a very promising offer, James, Madalena replied sadly. It's the best I can do, Madalena, he told her firmly, still not sure he even wanted her to say yes. I guess I'll have to decline then. Close the door on your way out, James thought bitterly. And that was that. What about Beth? Madalena asked. She'll have to live with me and Tom. Over my dead body, Madalena, James replied angrily. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen. We'll see, James, Madalena smiled at him. If you think you can hold on to Beth, you're in for some surprises. Back off, Madalena, James hissed. Go back to your jailbird lover. No court in the world is going to give you custody while you're with that loser. Madalena didn't say anything else. She just got up, walked out, and left. Yeah, and she slammed the front door so hard it nearly came off its hinges. That's a one-way street, isn't it? James didn't think so. In fact, he had a horrible feeling that the game had only just begun. For the next 4 or 5 days, he heard nothing from them. It was like sitting in the trenches during World War I, waiting for the next barrage or major offensive to hit. He took the opportunity to meet with Tim, his buddy who was also his lawyer, but left there feeling less certain about his chances of getting custody of Beth. 50-50, Tim advised him glumly. If she can prove she's in a stable relationship, the court might side with her. But he's a goddamn ex-con, James tried to object. He bloody killed someone. That wasn't true, of course, but even Tim didn't know that. He killed someone in an accident, James, his friend informed him. He's paid his debt to society and has the same rights as everyone else now. How does he look? Does he seem sketchy or something? Is there anything we can use against him? I have no idea, James had to admit. I've never met him. Never even seen him. Maybe you should, James. James took Beth to dance class, arranging for another mom to pick her up. He returned home to find Madalena waiting. They argued about their situation, with Madalena proposing an arrangement where she'd live with James and Beth but visit Tom nearby. James rejected this idea outright. He offered to take her back if she cut ties with Tom, but Madalena declined. The conversation turned hostile when discussing Beth's custody, with Madalena threatening legal action and James vowing to fight back. Madalena left, slamming the door. James felt the real battle was just beginning. He consulted his lawyer friend Tim about custody chances, learning it might be a 50-50 split if Madalena could prove a stable relationship with Tom. James was frustrated that Tom's ex-con status might not work against him in court. Tim suggested James should meet Tom, but James admitted he'd never even seen the man. All this time, James had been showering Beth with love and attention, coming up with various excuses for why her beloved mommy hadn't been around. When's mommy coming home, Daddy? She'd ask sleepily. Soon, honey, he'd tell her, unable to break her heart with the truth just yet. I miss mommy. Me too, honey, he'd reply, tears in his eyes as he hugged her tight. And he did miss her. God, how he missed that woman. James was about to meet this Tom character much sooner than he'd anticipated when his buddy called and asked him to come to a meeting with the other parties, as he put it, and their attorney. He put on his game face as he walked into the meeting, wondering what this Tom guy really looked like. Come on, biker, Hell's Angel and all that. James was expecting some fat, long-haired lowlife. The tall, clean-shaven, blonde-haired, somewhat slender, and athletically built man who appeared before him took James completely by surprise. Hi, James, he greeted him with a nervous smile, extending his hand. I'm sorry we have to meet like this. I'm actually sorry about all of this. James really wanted to hate this guy, but he accepted the handshake. At least he wasn't smiling too much. Maybe this wouldn't be as tough as he'd thought. How wrong he'd been. Mr. Dawson, their lawyer, a corpulent, grinning bastard, opened the proceedings. It's quite obvious that your wife isn't going to take you back, so there's no point in you trying to make that happen. Tim, James's lawyer, held out his hand to keep James from decking the guy and accepted the challenge. I don't think my client is interested in that possibility either, he objected. As far as we understand it, this is simply a matter of deciding your client's access to the daughter from this marriage. Obviously, my client will be the primary custodian and she will live with him, but he's willing to grant reasonable access to his soon-to-be ex-wife. It's not that simple, the fat man replied with a smile that would make a shark proud. My client, that is to say, my clients, have first right to the child. Bullshit, James exclaimed, but Tim ordered him to calm down again. The fact that my client, Mrs. Dawson, is the mother of the child is not in dispute, the fat man continued. Are we in agreement on that? Tim acknowledged the fact, throwing James a reassuring look, just as James was puzzled by the other guy's line of thinking. Then we also have to acknowledge who the father is, the bastard continued. This time, Tim had to physically restrain James from confronting the asshole. My clients claim that Mr. Dawson is not the father of the child, and the father is her ex-boyfriend, Mr. Thomas Wellings. Tom? Tom is Beth's father? What the hell kind of nonsense is that? James was so shocked that he just sat there with his mouth hanging open. We have documentary evidence, medical evidence, that Mr. Wellings is 99% certain to be the child's biological father. We also have irrefutable evidence that your client, Mr. Dawson, cannot be the father. What the hell are you talking about? James shouted at the fat bastard. Beth is my daughter. I was there when she was born, and I brought her home. Apparently not, Mr. Dawson, the fat man interrupted him. You may have brought her home as your daughter, but you are not her biological father. It is my client, Mr. Wellings. But that's impossible, James protested. He was in prison when Madalena got pregnant. I was there when she was born, for Christ's sake. It's just not possible. My clients explained that to Mr. Dawson, he continued monotonously. Apparently, you were in Canada when Mr. Wellings' mother died, and he was granted compassionate leave from prison to attend her funeral. My client, Mrs. Dawson, then Miss Jones, also attended the funeral, and they, well, let's just say they had the opportunity to get reacquainted. James felt the room begin to spin as he took in what the lawyer was telling him. He couldn't believe it, but deep down he knew it was possible. He was swarthy and generally stocky. Beth was tall, slender and blonde, just like her real father. As the room swirled around him, Madalena burst into tears and ran out of the room. Tom got up to follow her but hesitated. I'm sorry, James, he said. I swear to you, Madalena had no idea you weren't Beth's father until she started growing up and looked like me. That excuses her? James shouted at him. Does that make it okay to screw around with you when she was actually engaged to me? No, Tom agreed quietly, shaking his head. Madalena has no excuse for her behavior, but I love her. James, I'm so sorry. With those words, he turned on his heels and followed Madalena out of the office. Well, Mr. Dawson, the fat lawyer spoke again. Can we strike a deal? I'm having a busy day, so if we could come to some acceptable terms, perhaps. Before James could react, Tim jumped to his feet and yelled at the other attorney. "Shut up, you miserable bastard. One more word and I swear I'll ram your nose through the back of your head myself." Not very professional, the fat man remarked snidely, but stood up, gathered his papers, and hurried out of the office. "You'll be hearing from me." "Sorry, James," sighed his buddy, his personal legal eagle. "I didn't see that coming." "No," James muttered. "Neither did I." James's story didn't end there, but it's worth mentioning that the sight of Madalena's back as she ran out of the office was the last time he ever laid eyes on her. If he'd known that then, maybe his actions over the next few months would have been different. But looking back, probably not. Tim called his secretary and told her to cancel everything for the rest of the day. Despite her protests, he practically dragged James, who was in a daze, to the nearest pub. There, the two of them downed the first 3 pints in the time it took to order them. Within the next hour, as if by magic, 5 or 6 of James's best mates showed up to help him drink himself into oblivion. James couldn't remember how the night ended or how he left. He couldn't even recall the next day. His first coherent thought came the following morning when he woke up in a strange bed with a woman he didn't recognize. He never figured out what the deal was there, but if anyone was paying her, it certainly wasn't him. Anyway, the girl vanished, and he never saw her again. Now, James isn't going to pretend that a dark cloud descended on him and he withdrew from the world. He's the kind of guy who sees his glass as half full, not half empty. With that positive attitude, he set out to get his life back on track. Okay, there was a black cloud, of course, but he tried his best to push through it. He met up with anyone who crossed his path, pretty or not, but most often he found himself hanging out with women who had kids, single moms or divorcees. As you can imagine, this made him quite popular, and he got his fair share of action. But the only one he really developed feelings for dumped him when she accused him of only wanting her for her daughter. That's right, James was trying, maybe a bit too hard, to replace his daughter Beth. He was looking for a partner to fill that Beth-shaped hole in his life. Crazy? Yeah, he knew it, but that's what grief does to a person. Eventually, he realized what he was doing and tried to work through it. It cut down on the number of women he dated, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. What about Beth herself, you might reasonably ask? Yeah, James insisted on having access to her, even though there was no blood connection between them. But it was a bloody disaster. Madalena and Tom moved back to Leeds, and James had to come up one weekend a month to visit her. To be fair, neither Madalena nor Tom made it difficult. They did everything they could to make the trip easier for him. It was Tom he talked to every time he called, and it was Tom who met him when he came to pick up Beth. And Madalena, perhaps wisely, made sure she was nowhere to be seen. But it didn't go well. Poor Beth was just confused and spent all day trying to talk James into coming to live with them, not realizing at her tender age how unlikely that was to ever happen. She went on and on about it, unable to accept that Daddy didn't love Mommy anymore, constantly telling him how great Papa Tom was and how happy he'd be if he moved in. When James took her back, she'd start crying when she realized he was leaving again. She'd cling to him, screaming and throwing tantrums. Eventually, Tom had to pry her off him and hold her as James ran out of the house, his tears matching poor Beth's. It was awful and broke James's heart all over again, maybe even worse than before. It was the hardest decision he'd ever made, but he vowed from that moment on that he wouldn't visit her again. He couldn't put little Beth through that kind of trauma again, and he didn't think he could take it either. When he told Tom about his decision, Tom tried to talk him out of it, saying they'd do everything they could to make it less traumatic next time. But deep down, they both knew it had to be for the best. In the end, they agreed that James would give it 6 months to let Beth settle into her new life, and then they'd reassess. They agreed, but they both knew what that really meant. For her sake, James would no longer be involved in her life. Maybe when she grows up, James promised himself. Maybe when she graduates high school or something. He made all sorts of promises to himself, but in reality, he was once again completely on his own. And the memories of his wife and daughter were just that, memories. James will be forever grateful that he wasn't suicidal. Life went on as it usually does, and his painful memories faded somewhat. Time, they say, is a wonderful healer, but James can assure you that it's not a miracle cure. It takes work, and he worked at it, carving out a new life for himself. When the first Christmas came, he couldn't let it go by without doing something. He went and bought a gift for Beth and sent it off, not knowing how to sign it or say who it was from, not wanting to reopen old wounds. He was quite surprised when he received a letter from Leeds the week after Christmas. Yeah, Beth had written him a little note thanking him and telling him a bit about her life. Obviously, some adult had helped her, and James was pretty sure it was Tom, not his ex-wife. He wondered if Madalena even knew the letter had been sent, but he didn't let himself dwell on that possibility. In the letter, Beth referred to him as Papa James. James knew this meant he'd been demoted and that Daddy was undoubtedly now Tom, but it actually cheered him up a lot. He was sure that Beth had two parents who loved her and that he had a name by which she'd probably always remember him, Papa James. James kept sending Beth gifts for every birthday and Christmas, and he kept getting thank you letters from her, along with pictures. He proudly noted how her handwriting improved over the next couple of years. Often, Tom would slip in a little note to let James know how well Beth was doing in school or dance class, but he never once suggested that James should visit her again. James harbored secret hopes that they'd meet again soon, but about a year later, Beth mentioned her little brother in one of her letters. That's when James realized he'd better not drag this out. Tom and Madalena had 2 kids now, and James wasn't part of that family anymore. Fast forward a bit. It's not exactly shocking that James's buddy Tim's wife had a friend. Well, she had loads of friends, but you know what I mean. This one was named Sally. She was a lawyer, a couple years younger than James, with dark hair and a slender build. Oh, and she had the most fantastic pair of legs James had ever seen. The fact that I'm even mentioning Sally here obviously means she became something special. Their interests lined up so perfectly, it was like they were meant for each other. Eventually, James popped the question. They were both divorced, had good jobs, and were head over heels for each other. James, Sally answered with a wide smile, "I'd love to." But there was a but. An unspoken but undeniable but. "What is it, Sally?" James asked, wondering what the catch might be. "I know your story, James," she replied quietly. "You're going to want to have children, aren't you?" "Of course, Sally," James grinned back. "At least 2, maybe more." "But I can't have children, James," she dropped the bombshell. "That's why my last marriage broke up. My ex desperately wanted a son to carry on his family name." "You never told me that," James whispered, remembering that Sally's ex-husband David was some minor aristocrat or something. Which explained why a son would be so important. "Whose fault is it?" James asked gently. "Mine, James. We got tested, and David was fine. But my eggs, they're not quite up to scratch. It's not impossible, but it's not very likely." "And he ended your marriage just because of that?" James asked, surprised. David had always seemed like such a nice, reasonable guy whenever James had met him. "No, it wasn't just that," Sally answered, a hint of sadness in her voice. "But it was that little problem that led to arguments and eventually to our divorce." "I'm so sorry, Sally." "I had no idea," James said, feeling terrible. "Couldn't you have adopted or something?" "I would have been open to adoption, but David's family was totally against it. It ended up driving a wedge between us." "That's rough," James commented. "Very," she agreed. "But then I wouldn't have met you, would I? So you'll marry me?" James pounced on the opportunity. The conversation went on, with Sally worrying that she didn't want another marriage to fail for the same reason, and James trying to assure her that he'd accept it. They talked about possible adoption or other artificial means, which Sally, with her background, knew much more about than James did. Truth be told, they had a lot to think about, and neither of them was getting any younger. "Why don't you ask me again in 3 months?" Sally suggested at last. "When you've had time to really think about it. How about I leave the question on the table, and you give me the answer in 3 months?" James countered. "Earlier if you want." That's how they left things. James wanted her to say yes, but deep down, he had to admit he had his doubts. He really wanted a child of his own. More than one, to be honest. Adoption and everything else left him feeling uncertain. Unfortunately, so uncertain that tiny cracks started to appear in their relationship that hadn't been there before. There was no doubt that they would break up, and they were still very happy together. But the doubts were there, and the question of marriage quietly took a back seat. James was in his office, wrestling with a project budget when an unexpected call came in. The caller, Mrs. Murphy from Headling Social Services, asked security questions about his ex-wife Madalena. Curious and slightly annoyed, James answered her questions. Then came the shock. Madalena and Tom had died in a motorcycle accident 6 days ago. James's mind reeled. What about Beth? He exclaimed, suddenly panicked. The social worker assured him Beth wasn't in the accident but was distressed and asking for him. It had taken them days to locate James. Where is she? James shouted into the phone. I'm on my way. I'll come and get her. The woman gave him the address, and 5 minutes later, James was in his car, tearing out of the parking lot, his all-important project completely forgotten. James felt like he was going to jump out of his skin as he sat in Mrs. Murphy's cluttered office, trying to convince her that he really was who he said he was, and that there was no doubt he wanted Beth. To his surprise, he discovered that Tom and Madalena had never changed the legal situation. Of course, James hadn't heard anything about an adoption request. Legally speaking, he was still Beth's father, since that's what it said on her birth certificate. James was a mess of emotions. He was devastated by the news of Madalena and Tom's deaths, even considering what she'd done to him. But he was so excited to see Beth again that those feelings got pushed to the back burner. Finally, there was a knock on the door, and another woman entered the room, holding Beth's hand. James's Beth. The first time he'd seen her in almost 4 years. Daddy? Beth asked timidly. No wonder she was uncertain. Even though James had been sent pictures of her, she hadn't seen him since she was 4 years old. Yes, it's me, honey, James choked out. The first tear trickled down his cheek as he held out his arms to her. Daddy, Daddy, she screamed, running up to him. I've missed you. I knew you'd come for me. James had completely forgotten about one crucial detail, and that oversight suddenly became apparent as he hugged his daughter. When he tried to lift Beth into his arms, something was off. He looked down and was surprised to see another toddler clinging tightly to Beth's skirt. He'd forgotten. Beth had a little brother. This is Jimmy, Beth introduced, as James set her down. The 3-year-old boy looked scared but brave, a sturdy little fellow with dark hair. Hi, Jimmy, James smiled. Beth encouraged, it's Papa James, Jimmy. Say hi. Papa James, who was your real daddy? Jimmy asked Beth, eyeing James. Yes, Jimmy, she replied. He's going to be our daddy now. Jimmy muttered, my mommy and daddy went to heaven. Aren't you our new daddy? James asked Jimmy's age, learning he was 3 and 4 months old, born on November 7th. Suddenly, James realized Jimmy was his son. The timing fit perfectly with his last encounter with Madalena, about a month before Tom's release from prison. Come give your daddy a hug, kiddo, James grinned. After a moment's hesitation, Jimmy jumped into his arms, followed by Beth. They hugged and cried together. Legal matters were quickly settled, and the next day, James introduced the children to Sally. Are you going to be our new mom? Jimmy asked innocently. Sally, teary-eyed, replied, if your daddy still wants me, I'd love to be your new mom. The end. Or maybe, just maybe, it's only the beginning of a whole new chapter. After all, with a grandkid on the way, who knows what adventures lie ahead for James and his unconventional, but utterly perfect, family.